Thanks for coming to share some information about user-centered design today. This is a topic that's very important to the people on this stage, and I expect it's a very important topic to you too, because we're all focusing on doing the best things for our users. Before we begin, I would like to point out the URL on your screen. As we go through this presentation, we're going to ask you a few questions. We want to hear from you about your views and some of your experiences on this topic. So to help us, we'd love for you to participate by pointing your browsers to the URL on the screen, pollev, pollev.com/ACRL. And we know some of you have already gone to that site and you've already voted, so we appreciate that. We'll do a few of those through this presentation and share the results with you as we go along. So thanks to those of you who already got us started. So sometimes we ask this question, is it you or is it the door? How many of you have run into situations where you're just not sure what to do? I know I have. So that's kind of some context for what we're talking about. Since you're interested in user design, you may be familiar with the term Norman door. This was named after Don Norman, who is the author of The Design of Everyday Things, and I know that's a classic, a standard for people who work in design. A so-called Norman door has design elements that give you the wrong signals. They don't really tell you what to do, to the point that sometimes special signage is needed to clarify what action you should take. Should you pull or should you push? Often creating, confusion or frustration. So in our lives, though, good design is actually a lot harder to notice than poor design, mainly because good designs fit our needs so well that the design is essentially invisible. But bad design, on the other hand, is usually hard to miss. So during the next hour or so, you're going to hear from 3 experts who have a variety of experiences, but no matter where they worked before or what they're doing now, they have always focused on putting the needs of users first as they work on design. From them, you will gain an understanding of how to apply some core concepts of design in the context of academic library settings and focusing on the needs of our students, our faculty, and our staff. First, you will hear from Kayla Broadman, who will provide some foundational information about user design from her experience in a variety of industries. Kayla leads the User Experience and Visual Design team at OCLC. She recently joined OCLC after a decade in advertising and digital innovation agencies. Her experience spans startups to Fortune 100 companies in industries that include automotive, pharmaceutical, healthcare, and consumer packaged goods. Now she's looking forward to continuing this work in the library space. Ruth Spoonar will share her experiences in user-centered design in the context of libraries. Ruth is an information fluency coordinator for the Private Academic Library Network of Indiana, also known as PALNI. In this role, Ruth creates and implements usability and user needs studies, plans professional development events for librarians, and generally facilitates collaboration among librarians. She does this in addition to working as a reference and instruction librarian at DePauw University. And wrapping up our program today will be Tom Haney. Tom is a senior product manager at OCLC. He's focused on creating fantastic experiences, and you'll hear about some of those today, that help people find and get the information they need. Tom has created and managed online consumer websites in addition to working in banking, information security, and mobile. Tom will share insights from his work with libraries at OCLC and with the other industries in which he has worked. Our presenters have prepared a list of recommended best practices for user-centered design. There are some hard copies on the table in the back of the room and the chair by the door, and we also have placed this online, and we will put the URL for online access to that resource on the screen at the end of the presentation. I encourage you to download it because there are links to some recommended additional resources from our presenters in that checklist for you. So we're going to begin with Kayla Broadman, and while Kayla's coming to the podium, please make sure you get your votes in at that polling site. Thank you.
So we wanted to ask this question: how familiar are you with user-centered design? Because we kind of wanted to see what everyone's experience was in the room. So it looks like we have some definitely interest as well as gamut across the board of from the room. So that's great. So one other thing that ideally you could participate in is a name of a company or an organization inside or outside the library industry whose user experience inspires you. We'll revisit this in a bit. So if we start with user-centered design in context, what is user-centered design? This is a diagram that it kind of illustrates user-centered design, but the core focus of user-centered design is focusing on the user's context across the design process. So as you understand the context of the use, specifying user requirements, the design solution, and then evaluating against the requirements, across that spectrum of the process, you're always focusing on the user and what context they're actually using the solution. When we try to illustrate the user's context, one of the things we use is an empathy map. This is a really good shorthand for fully developed personas that illustrates the user's feelings, the tasks that they need to complete, their thoughts and influences, but most importantly, their pain points and overall goals. One of the key things in my experience is understanding the user in all these different facets, because it helps you get insight into the user's life, and then you can develop more relevant experiences based on what you know about them. Another important consideration in this process of user-centered design is the user's environment and the context. User experience is a subset of the overall customer experience. The things that need to be included and considered for is the communication, the customer service, item delivery, and marketing reputation. Those are all facets of the customer experience, whereas the user experience, the accessibility, the content strategy, the information hierarchy, interaction design, visual design, and usability, those things are important to consider when you're setting expectations. So the expectations of the user experience can set expectations for what the physical environment is and the customer experience, and vice versa. So as we evaluate against the requirements, it's important to remember that the user's requirements and the library goals or technology requirements may be different. So the user's needs, how they interact with technology, how they prefer to interact with technology, and how that maps to the library goals, for example, and the technological requirements. And sometimes those look like constraints, depending on what the site can do or what the infrastructure may look like. That determines then how you move forward with your solution. So user-centered design has actually really changed users' experience expectations over the course of time. Because user-centered design is often design-led, actually, things like personalization have become really important to users. They have the same expectations that they have of sites like Netflix, Amazon, and Airbnb as they do their an organization site, a library site, an institution site. So Netflix, for example, because you watch something, recommends another movie, for example, because of your preferences or things that you've done or interacted with on their site. Same thing with Amazon. Airbnb recommends things based on searches you've done, for example. Another evolving expectation of users is curated content. Now, libraries do this really well, but maybe in a different way. Companies, again, like Airbnb and Wayfair, use it to keep their brand top of mind, as well as show their added value and curation of content to the user. So it's an added service to them to show their value to the user. Automation, Home Depot and Square, for example, will send you an email with your receipt if you use a particular credit card. They actually sense this. Amazon now sends you pictures of your package on your front porch. LastPass, entering passwords on your mobile device is so 2000. Now you can use your fingerprint and essentially just log into a site. And then Pinterest, it recognizes what board an item might need to be in because of how it's been tagged, how other users have decided it needed to be collected in their boards on their space. So these are all examples of how the user doesn't have to do things manually anymore. And finally, conversational UI is essentially artificial intelligence, often powered by chatbots. It's used across different industries. Facebook has chatbots that act in more of a customer service kind of aspect. This one is Ada, which is a health app. What Ada does is it helps you kind of determine next steps with your healthcare provider. So if you enter headache, it matches headaches, what kind of things might be associated with a headache, sinus pain, pain behind the eye, and then based on those selections, it kind of might say, well, you might have eye strain based on your selections. But that helps you kind of then know what next steps might need to be, like, oh, I can probably go to, this general practitioner, for example, for this sort of thing. So when we go back to naming a company or organization, thank you for all that participated here. Apple is very large and in charge on this, so I am not surprised. Amazon as well. Amazon really helps you find what you are looking for. Sometimes it separates the words, so I'm seeing names of libraries here in particular, so that's great. Awesome. Well, thank you again, and now I'm going to turn it over to Ruth.
We have another survey question for you. Going back to the your levels of UX. So are you aware of any UX initiatives currently underway at your institution? So it doesn't have to be one that you are participating in, just are you aware of some currently happening? So today I'm going to share with you a little about my own journey through the world of user-centered design over the last few years. Understanding and responding to user needs has always been at the heart of librarianship, although in recent years this has taken a more intentional approach through the development of library user experience positions and departments. Such positions are a mere fantasy, though, for many smaller libraries, where librarian teams of 3 or 4 run the entire show. For the 24-member libraries of the Private Academic Library Network of Indiana, Consortium, or PALNI, this is regularly the case. However, by leveraging existing collaborative relationships, utilizing changes in library systems and consortium staffing, and of course, picking up a few new cardigans, PALNI has been studying library user experience at scale with a collaborative usability testing model. So you can see more about PALNI there on the slide. In 2014, Eric Bradley and I were hired as PALNI's first information fluency coordinators. In this part-time role, we are responsible for coordinating activities for the reference, instruction, and outreach librarians for PALNI. This includes planning professional development events and opportunities, organizing and running task forces, and a whole lot of other duties as assigned. One of the first of these duties was a collaborative usability test for our newly implemented discovery layer. With the addition of PALNI's communication director, we each visited one PALNI school per semester and interviewed students for an entire day of research. We asked each student to perform 3 or 4 tasks using the discovery layer and recorded their screen and voice as they attempted the tasks. We did this for 3 semesters in 2015 and 2016, changing the tasks each semester, and we learned a lot about our users and even more about how to, or not to, conduct user testing. This was our first time experiencing any sort of usability testing, and one of the most valuable things we did was to consult an expert while we were developing our plan for testing. We met with a user researcher from OCLC, one of Kayla's colleagues, who gave us really helpful advice and suggestions. This gave us such a great foundation for our first rounds of testing. The most valuable thing that he told us was to start with the end in mind. Make sure that you have clear objectives for what data you are trying to obtain. If you leave your objectives open-ended, you will spend the rest of your life reviewing the data, and you'll learn something new about your users every time. Of course, this mirrors how those of us in the library instruction world should approach our instruction sessions with students. We can't possibly teach them everything in a 1-hour session. What are the most important things we want them to take away? Once we establish that, then we can build our sessions and our user studies. And on the handout, once you get a physical copy or the virtual copy, there are suggestions on there for when to use different types of methods. So when you should use a survey versus other types of methods. So before we did our first usability test, we standardized our testing process as much as possible. The first thing we did was to choose uniforms. And we're librarians, so we got cardigans. Yay, cardigans. And there you can see, those are my colleagues. We all three presented at a conference once, and it was very fun to walk around with matching cardigans at a library conference. So we ordered matching logo cardigans from Land's End, and we wore those every time we did testing. This allowed us to look similar as possible and avoid skewing participants' impressions. We chose cardigans in blue because color theory suggests that blue persuades the participants to trust the facilitator while feeling calm and confident. We also worked together to create a very detailed script for the testing that was used by each facilitator for each test. One important opportunity we had from this setup was the ability to test different implementations of the same product. We could examine the search boxes on library websites, the default search options, and more. This type of comparative data led us to be able to make conclusive configuration recommendations for the whole consortium and showed problems unique to the institutions versus general user problems. The chance to test multiple schools also provided a lot more data, which reduced the likelihood of testing only outliers. This spring, Eric, sitting next to me there, and I have repeated our usability experiences by rerunning one of our original sets of tasks. This has allowed us to see how our users work with changes in the product, and we expect to be able to make some new recommendations for improvements. It's also really nice to see the change in my own comfort levels with user testing. It's been way more laid back this time around. Doing all of these rounds of testing has been incredibly helpful as we work with our vendor, OCLC in this case, to improve the product. OCLC has always been fantastic about taking librarian input into account as they work on product development. And no, they didn't pay me to say that. But I think it's really valuable to them for me to be able to speak with authority on how my users work with the product versus just anecdotal evidence, or even worse, opinionated librarian thoughts on how a product should work. So many times we as librarians, we have such high expectations for products, and we have high levels of experience with the product. So our user experience is so different than that of our actual users. While I was preparing for this talk, I went back and I reviewed the reports that we produced following the usability tests and our vendor recommendation sections. I found multiple instances where we requested a change, which is now available in the product. So at this point, you may be wondering, well, that's great. Ruth has an awesome working relationship with OCLC. Here I am on a panel with them. But you guys are stuck with vendor so-and-so. They show no interest in your opinions. What do I do? For most products, even if you can't liaise with the vendor directly, you can make customization choices. So try running a usability test on the configurable options you have available to you and work within those options to make the product more usable. Also, just a couple weeks ago, I got an email from EBSCO inviting me to become part of their database of willing user experience testers. Watch for similar opportunities from your vendors, or reach out and ask them, do they have a group? Can you be added to it? After our first rounds of usability testing, we switched gears a little and we began to develop a collaborative user needs assessment. Just like when we began usability testing, we started by consulting an expert. We had a really great conversation with Andrew Asher, who is currently at IU. He gave us some good advice to get started. He was especially helpful with guidance for choosing methods for our study. There are a lot of ethnographic methods. One of the links that I added to the checklist is for an Andrew Asher resource that links you to some of the methods that you could use. So we wrote a toolkit with a standard set of research questions and 5 methods schools could choose from to implement. The methods that we used included interviews, photo collaging, photo essays, day mapping, and library mapping. We went with the toolkit approach so that anyone could facilitate the assessment. We've been working with each school in Pownley. Again, there's 24 of them. And so far we've made it to 7 schools, and number 8 happened, so we've actually been to 8, but number 8 happened last week, and number 9 is happening in 2 weeks. So this assessment has given us valuable data about our users and better ways we can support them. So for example, on the slide, if you see that fancy green chair That was purchased after we visited a school and their students asked for better furniture. That same school purchased a water cooler. All their students said, we really want to stay hydrated while we're studying, but we can't find anywhere to get water. So they purchased a water cooler, the kind of thing you wouldn't necessarily think of, but the students suggested it. One semester, there in the middle, we did a fun usability testing session on our LibGuides. We usually hold in-person meetings for our librarians once a semester. In spring 2017, we wrote another toolkit, this time with all the tasks and procedures to let everyone present do a usability test on their own LibGuides. The participants walked away with great student feedback on their guides, and they then had the toolkit to allow them to go back to their own schools. They could talk with more students and get more feedback about their guides. One thing I've learned, user testing often feels like an intimidating task that's hard and a super heavy time commitment, but if you can find some partners, you can see all my partners on the screen, it helps a lot. It takes some of the intimidation out of it, and it also helps with the time. So if you're in a small school like me, can you find a partner in a nearby similarly sized school? We have at least one project a semester that we have running with our colleagues. And so after a few semesters, all the parts of user testing that originally felt overwhelming, now it feels second nature. I submitted 2 IRB proposals to DePauw this semester, and the second one, they emailed me within 48 hours and said, thank you for submitting such a well-written proposal. So it's definitely getting easier every time. If you aren't the person, if you're at a bigger school and you aren't the person responsible for conducting user testing for your library or organization, I highly recommend observing some. Observe something for a product testing session, observe a building testing session, follow your users around. Our users never cease to surprise me. The things they do, it will surprise you as well. All right, so we are going to look at some survey results. So looks like 59% of you know about, at least, a UX initiative at your institution. So what we would like to know is, especially for the 41%, what barriers or challenges are preventing you from focusing on UX at your institution? In our program summary, we promised to include some actual stories about user testing. My best story comes from one semester. I just told you how easy it was to do the DePauw IRB this semester. I think it took me 4 months to get IRB approval at this school. So after 4 months of going back and forth with our IRB, it was finally testing day. So I put on my fancy blue cardigan and I headed over to the school. Within an hour, my hands were numb. That's how cold it was in that room. So my super kind and awesome hosts were like, oh, we have a heater, we'll give it to you. So I put a heater under the desk. So I'm sitting there and I'm finally starting to warm up in the middle of a test with a student, and the door is locked, and the door to the room suddenly bangs open. The janitor comes waltzing in and says, why is the door locked? I have to collect the trash right now. We were like, okay. So then we went to lunch, came back to the room, and the temperature changed so drastically that then I was sweating. Like, I took off my cardigan. We also have polo shirts that we wear underneath of them. So I was wearing my polo shirt, and my host brought me a fan. So in one day, I needed a heater, a fan, and I had a janitor on my audio recording. So it was a very entertaining day of testing. So let's see if anybody had a janitor pop in on them. Nobody says janitor. Someone said Batman. I want to know who says Batman. I want to come to your school if Batman is there. That's awesome. So shockingly, time is what I expected. I expected money to be a little bigger, actually, but time was the one I expected to be the number one. And there are definitely lots of other things that come into play. So since I expected the top one to be time and money, as I mentioned, we've been doing a usability test this semester across 2 Pownley schools. I tested 9 participants, which is more than I had to. I didn't have to do quite as many. So the planning and testing for that particular test took about 9 hours of my time. The analysis and report writing took about 7 hours. We gave each participant a $10 Amazon gift card. So for less than $100 and 16 hours of my time, we've got some really great data for our schools and for OCLC. So adding some usability practices does not have to take large amounts of time or money. Also, we tend to write really long, really detailed reports. We've got all sorts of charts and graphs. If you can manage to write a more informal report, and you can do it quicker, you probably wouldn't have to spend quite as long working on your reporting. You could also use students to help you out. I've heard of several schools that have a dedicated group of students who help to plan or implement their user studies. For our user needs assessment, we have a specific grad student, and she's just a few hours a semester. But she can visit the schools when necessary. She helps us conduct the methods, and yay, she does all the coding, which is the most boring part of doing a test. So this saves us on tons of time. I said we'd been to 7 schools, so all we have to do half the time is read the coded data and write the report. So we've enjoyed our usability experiences immensely. It's a great chance to visit with the both library staff, faculty, and students from other institutions in our consortium. Working collaboratively has proven to be a success in our consortia, where smaller libraries, short staff, and minimal resources make it otherwise impossible to conduct large-scale usability testing. And we always welcome having another cardigan in our wardrobe. If you're interested in seeing either our LibGuides usability toolkit or the user needs assessment toolkit, links to them are on the handout. You can feel free to use them, adapt them, and have them help you. And with that, I will turn it over to Tom.
That's excellent, Ruth. Thank you.
Sure.
That's great.
Wait for my report. See what you say.
Yeah, I am waiting. Hello, I'm Tom. I'm a Senior Product Manager at OCLC, and really glad to be here and get to talk to everybody. And we'll have some time for a Q&A after I do a little bit here. So if you have questions, be thinking about those, and we can have a bit of a discussion at the end here. So this is our final poll question. The question is, what have you done with the results of UX research? So I'm going to put up the results here in just 1 minute, but check it out or think about it. You know, if you have UX research or you've seen UX research coming out of your institution, what's been the next step? What's been the outcome of that? So interesting breakdown. You know, you might have a situation in a room like this where, you know, half the room maybe hasn't conducted or is not aware of UX research, but has an interest in it and has some understanding of its value. Or maybe they have other people conducting the research on their behalf, so they're not doing it themselves. And, you know, in the other half of the room, really taking advantage of user-centered design and UX research is something that they can do to help them meet their goals and to help their patrons find the information they need. You know, for the situations where you have an interest in user-centered design, or you actually have some user experience data, and you haven't been able to get as much value out of it as you want to get, a good thing to do is to focus on the culture and try to get this idea of putting the user first into the culture. For example, I worked in banking and I was a product manager, and we did a lot of effort to understand how certain users were interacting with the systems that we had. And these users were actually employees of the banking institutions. So they were like financial advisors, customer service reps, clerks, things like that. And so we got a group of people that were really enthusiastic about user-centered design, and we did a bunch of research, got some great information. But responding to that wasn't within the culture of the organization, because the people that we were dealing with, they were like internal customers. They weren't the customers that were paying the bills, and so it was an uphill battle to even get the results and insights that we had to be incorporated into the designs of the products that we were working on. And when we were able to do better with that was when we started to help people understand why it was valuable, to the point that we could get it more into the culture. Now, working with libraries and academic institutions, there's more of a built-in understanding than there would be in an industry like banking, that responding to this user expectations is important. And also, user expectations are much more fluid and volatile than they would have been 10 or 20 years ago, because especially if you think of the student population, they're dealing so much with mobile and getting so much value out of it, that then they're looking to get that type of value out of other things that they're doing. And so it's becoming more and more important. At OCLC, part of the way that we undertake this challenge of incorporating it into the culture is we come up with a statement and an understanding that the user is at the center of all that we do. And so we have a slide like this that says the user is at the center of all that we do. And what we'll often do if we're having even an internal meeting about some problems that we're trying to solve or technologies that we're evolving, we'll start with a slide like this and put it up just as a reminder to everybody that the user's at the center of what we're doing here. And the recapitulation effect of saying it over and over, it works over time. And so that is a good way if you're trying to get user-centered design into the culture. Find a way to say it over and over so that people can understand in all different contexts. I mean, of course, if you're running a usability study, the user's at the center of all we do, people understand that. But when you can bring it up in other types of contexts, it's helpful. For OCLC, one of the products I work on is our discovery layer. And we have right now sort of 3 pillars that when we're working on initiatives, we have search innovation, intuitive user experience, and configuration. These are kind of 3 things that we're focused on right now on improving in these areas. Every couple years, these things kind of change. So our main thing right now might be search innovation, and in 2 years, we've made progress on that. Maybe our main thing becomes expanding content or something else. But what we've been doing is that as our major themes of what we're working on change, we've been keeping this intuitive user experience in the middle at all the time. So when we're changing the other things, they can change. But by having that consistent thread of focus on the user, that helps with the cultural aspect as well. There's a number of different techniques that we use. Some of them Kayla described earlier. Surveys are a very valuable thing to do. And the nice thing about surveys is that you could do them in ways that are very inexpensive and on the fly. You could do things like SurveyMonkey with very low investment. You can get some data back. If you're in a situation where the stakes are higher and you want to make the investment to get a really robust survey with comparisons to other institutions and all that, there's also a lot of more advanced techniques that you can do with surveys. So surveys are great. You can have different approaches to it. Meeting with customers is probably the best way. And in the library world, that also means meeting with patrons, staff, users. That we have a phrase that we use, which is that the phrase is, the answer is not in the building. And what can happen lots of times when you're trying to devise solutions for end users, you get 4 people in a room, like, say us 4. We all know something about what the user wants. And we may even have a very strong opinions about what it is. And we could sit in a room and come up with great solutions that are probably pretty good. But if we're just doing that, just us 4 all the time, we're missing the perspectives of what's really going on out there that we might not know about. We all have blind spots in some areas. So what we look to do is find ways to uncover those blind spots and definitely not let them sit out there for months, years at a time, which can happen if you don't get outside and talk outside your core group. So meeting with customers, meeting with patrons, all that is extremely important part of getting the voice of the user into your initiatives. We also have this approach called contextual inquiry. Contextual inquiry is a super effective way to bring the user into the process. With contextual inquiry, what you do is you find a user. This is especially good for workflow-based things that you're trying to work on. Sit with the user for like 2 or 3 hours and observe everything that they do. And when we do this, we try not to interfere too much, but we do ask questions. So for example, we might be sitting with an interlibrary loan librarian and they're going through and looking at their list and making choices, and then the librarian picks up the phone and calls somebody and asks them a question. So we say, all right, well, why did you call that person? What were you trying to find out? And, why didn't you just email them? And, what was sort of at the root of the reason you were doing that? And when we do the contextual inquiry, when possible, we like to have 2 people and then one person just taking notes, and then the other person kind of helping to guide the conversation. But the things that we find out that that people do are really amazing, and they're super important because you can easily devise and you could say, okay, a patron needs to perform a certain action, so let me present to them 3 ways to do it and test it and see which one they like the best, and then we'll go with that one. But if you could go first and get more to the root of like, what are they really doing now and why, before you start to give them the solutions, it's very helpful. Now, contextual inquiry is, you're talking about 2 or 3 hours with 2 people. It takes a little bit of time, so we kind of reserve those for the areas where the problems are harder to solve, or there's clearly a gap that needs to be closed. And then we use the surveys and the other techniques for other things. So for example, focus groups. This is a way less expensive, less intensive to get that voice of the customer into the process. And we found that we get a pretty high interest in focus groups. We had the search fulfillment initiatives we were working on, and so we kind of went out to our community and said, who would like to help us with this? And we got 53 members to come and help us with a focus group, and generated 97 ideas about what were the problems that needed to be solved and how we might solve them. And then what we frequently do in focus groups then is once we've generated a set of ideas, then we put that back out to the people in the room and say, help us vote on these, help us understand which of these maybe is the most valuable. And that's also a way of the people that are part of the focus group to get the ideas from the other ones in the room, because lots of times in focus group you kind of end up breaking out in smaller groups, and it's a way to come back and share that output with everybody, as well as get that voting information, which we find to be very useful. There are a few different segments of the life cycle of what we do with this user-centered design. That it does help to start by just understanding the user and their goals before you think too deeply about the possible solutions that are there. So that is often how we start. Understand the user, what are their goals, what are they trying to do, and then we break it down into scenarios so that we can understand the journey. So for example, we might have a thing where we have a certain persona, say an undergraduate. So we know the persona, and then we have a certain thing they're trying to accomplish. So we say, okay, they're attempting to gather materials for a research paper that's due tomorrow, and then different approaches they might take. So then we've identified, all right, there's some of them that will try to approach the entire thing with just electronic resources. And then there's some that are actually going to go into the library and sit down and try to do the whole thing in the library. And so we start by understanding those journeys by talking to the actual patrons, the actual people that are doing it, understanding the journeys first. Then we get into solutions. And when we start to develop solutions for all those things, we start to, especially if it's something like a website or a computer application, a mobile app, we do wireframes to say, here's how it might look. And then we show them different variations of how it might look, and then ask them, all right, show me how you would go through the journey based on these wireframe screens. And we get a lot of feedback from that, and we do a lot of iterations where we find that if they're struggling with a certain task, or they're not getting their final outcome, we do certain iterations to get it right. And we do all of that up front, because then we take those wireframes to the software engineering team and we say, this is what we would like you to build this. The more you do of that early, the less expensive the software development initiative becomes, because then you're not finding out later that, oh, this is not meeting the core task, and then you have to redesign, refactor stuff in code, which is just more time consuming and more expensive. But even when we're in the coding phase, we're actually developing it, continue to get that user input so that it can be refined. And sometimes there's a miss earlier, and finding that before you've released it, yet another way to kind of keep these whole projects more manageable. Because if we're going to miss something, we want to know before we put it out there and started, put thousands of people on it. So we do a lot of that iteration during the design process as we go.